Russia has faced a horrific crime, killing 137 people and injuring a further 100 people. Who is to blame? It seems Western media and politicians want us to believe that this attack is solely blamed and solely caused by ISIS. Nor the countries were involved, nor the political actors, just these crazy irrational fanatics who took their hatred out on Russia. But isn't it odd that while Israel are committing a plausible genocide, having committed countless war crimes against the Palestinian Muslims, including engineering a starvation, and while Western states like America and Britain have given full diplomatic cover to Israel and even supplied the very weapons used against the children of Gaza, that it's Russia that's the target of attack by ISIS, even though Russia have been opposed to Israel's aggression against the Palestinians, and it's Russia who are currently seen as a threat to the West. So why would ISIS target Russia? Are they really the sole agent behind the attacks against Russia? Or are there other hands involved in this terrible attack that's taken place? So who are the possible culprits behind the attack? Well, it seems we have two general scenarios or possible scenarios. Either it's solely an ISIS affair, or more specifically Islamic State province of Khorasan. There was no outside help. They were not being used as an agent for other powers, but they simply decided to attack Russia for their own political interests. The second possibility, that ISIS were just a gun and that there was someone else pulling the trigger, that some political actor or state wanted the attacks to occur or actually motivated those attacks to occur in order to achieve their goals and interests. Look, I get it. Whenever we talk about something that is slightly outside the narrow mainstream narrative, it suddenly is called a conspiracy theory. But let's face it, the mainstream media that has been sheepishly following Israel's propaganda are not the most trustworthy news agency out there. And to be honest, this is a tactic whenever a view that's expressed which goes outside of the mainstream political ideological narratives is constantly termed things like extreme, dangerous, radical, or a conspiracy theory. That's how you discredit people from going outside the mainstream. What they really want us to do is simply accept the political establishment's narrative on issues, not question or develop an informed alternative view to these events. So what I want to do and understand is which of these two possible scenarios is more plausible and what possible benefits and interests they may give to various political powers like America, Ukraine, Israel, or Russia. Firstly, we need a brief understanding of the background of ISIS. ISIS emerged in the backdrop of America's invasion of Iraq, and when the American-backed highly sectarian government began attacking Sunni Muslims in Iraq, many of those Sunni tribes began coalescing around ISIS and its leader, who at the time was Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi. It should also be noted that main leaders of ISIS had at one time been imprisoned together in an American facility called Camp Bucca in Iraq, and in fact were all released roughly at the same time together as well. And it also served an interest to release these quote-unquote radical Sunnis out into Iraq, because at the time America wanted to limit Iranian influence in Iraq, which was using Shia militias in Iraq to maintain some sort of control or influence. So releasing radical Sunni Muslims who began attacking Shia militias was the classic divide and rule policy the West loves to create. But as the West normally does, is they create a complete mess and it starts to blow up in their face. Then we also had the uprisings in Syria, with large portions of that population seeking to overthrow Bashar al Asad. And in fact, many of those opposition forces to Bashar's regime were in fact Islamic in character. ISIS used this as an opportunity to insert itself in the Syrian uprising. During this time, ISIS managed to take over Mosul, Iraq's second largest city. The American-backed Iraqi forces who were stationed at Mosul simply left, leaving behind a huge amounts of weapons which were now in the hands of ISIS. How convenient. ISIS then declared itself a caliphate and became fully involved in the Syrian uprising. However, rather than attacking Bashar al Assad's forces, which was at the time on the verge of collapse, they began attacking other Syrian revolutionary movements. Amazingly, territory that Syrian rebels had taken from Bashar al Assad were now being attacked by ISIS, who demanded that these other Syrian rebels give them allegiance, and if they didn't, they'd consider them as rebels against their authority and kill them. At this time, ISIS never or very rarely engaged with Bashar al Assad's forces, so Syrian rebel groups faced ISIS on one front and Bashar al-Assad's forces on the other front. Look, this issue is complicated, but what I want to show is that ISIS whether by design or not, ended up serving Bashar al Assad's interests and also the interests of wider political forces such as America, West, and even Russia, who didn't want to see a secular dictator fall to be replaced by an Islamic government. The relationship between the secular Syrian government and ISIS was a strange one as well. While in theory they were enemies, yet in practice the Syrian government was actually paying Syrian state employees, even those state employees that were in ISIS-controlled areas, while at the same time ISIS would tax these Syrian state employees 50%. So effectively what this meant is that the Syrian government was knowingly funding ISIS, as well as the fact that ISIS would even sell oil to the Syrian government. And it doesn't even stop there, because there are reports that ISIS clashed with Israeli forces only to supposedly apologize for that, claiming it was a mistake to attack Israel. The point here is that ISIS emerged in suspicious circumstances, ended up serving Western political interests by helping to secure the secular Alawi regime of the Syrian government, by fundamentally weakening the Syrian rebel groups. Once these groups no longer posed a threat against Bashar al Assad, the West and Russia turned its attention to ISIS and basically drove them out of Raqqa and Mosul. ISIS itself as well was infiltrated by various government intelligence agencies. For example, we know, for instance, Shamima Begum and 2 other school children who were trafficked to ISIS by a Canadian spy who had infiltrated the ISIS group. I just want you to think about this, that spies were being used to traffic Muslims, children who were being groomed on the internet. They were being trafficked by Western spies into ISIS. The media and politicians claim that since America's defeat in Afghanistan and Taliban's takeover, ISIS has re-emerged even stronger. Again, it's interesting to know that ISIS are fighting the Taliban, seeking to destabilize them after America failed to defeat the Taliban. So I wonder whose benefit is to see Afghanistan continue to be mired in more civil war. I wonder. But the point is, there's this claim that ISIS have gained greater capabilities now, meaning more weapons, more men, and of course more money. And it was ISIS and solely ISIS who were therefore motivated to attack Russia for their own interests. Now it's clear Russia, although currently attempts to present itself as pro-Muslim compared to the West, the fact remains Russia wholeheartedly backed Bashar al Assad's secular, brutal dictatorship in Syria. That Russia treats the Central Asian countries, which are mainly Muslim countries like Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, Kyrgyzstan and others, as its own backyard, and has previously supported dictatorships in these countries who have acted brutally against any opposition, including and mainly Islamic political opposition in the region. We also know Russia has undertaken a brutal invasion against Muslim populations in Chechnya in the 1990s, and then Putin installed his puppet Ramzan Kadyrov to control the Chechens to ensure they wouldn't be a threat against Russian interests again. So Russia, no matter what the recent PR has demonstrated, has shown antagonism against Muslims, particularly against the Muslims of the Caucasus and the Central Asian area. Well, the question is, what would ISIS seek to achieve from it? Would it weaken Russia so it'd loosen their grip on Central Asia or the Caucasus? Attacking a concert, would that really achieve that? Is it about creating public opinion in Russia so they would pressure their government to give up control over the Caucasus and Central Asia, ISIS to succumb to the demands of the terrorists? If anything, the opposite occurs, because these types of attacks actually galvanizes the population against terrorists and galvanizes them against the terrorist demands. If anything, there would be calls to move the focus away from Ukraine to fight this ISIS threat. So in the wider view, it seems not to achieve any political objective of interest for ISIS if ISIS acted alone. So what about Russia then? Putin used the bombings of the apartment blocks in Russia in 1999 to galvanize public opinion to invade Chechnya. Previously, Chechnya, a small country, had handed a humiliating defeat to Russia when they were calling for their independence against Russia after the fall of the Soviet Union. And the public had at the time no appetite to send their sons back for another war against Chechnya in order to invade it. Yet after the bombing of the apartment blocks, all changed, and now the public supported Russian invasion. In fact, this propelled Putin from prime minister to president in the same year. Many Russian commentators and political opponents like Alexander Yevhenko, who was assassinated by Russia, actually claimed Russia had undertaken a false flag operation, that they were in fact involved in the bombing of their own citizens to create the justification for war in Chechnya. So would Russia undertake a false flag operation using ISIS to attack its own theatre, its own concert, to galvanize some sort of public opinion to serve Russian state interests? For instance, we know that the first reaction of Putin was to blame Ukraine in this.
Столица России – это акция устрашения, как я уже сказал. И сразу же возникает вопрос, кому это выгодно? Это злодеяние может быть лишь звеном в целой серии попыток тех, кто с 2014 года воюет с нашей страной руками неонацистского киевского режима.
Claiming that these terrorists were heading to Ukraine as they had secured safe passage to Ukraine, thus indicating that there was some sort of premeditated collusion between Ukraine and ISIS. So is this about drumming up greater support from the Russian public to shore up this support against Ukraine? Well, it seems odd. So although there's definitely fears about public support for Russia's war waning, it seems odd Russia would use ISIS for this and not more of an overt Ukrainian group. Plus it comes across as exposing Russian security and weakens Putin's perception as a strong and capable leader. This is a point constantly emphasized in Western media, that Putin's reputation as a leader is weakened by this attack, not strengthened. Putin looks weak. He allowed gunmen to kill and injure hundreds of people. So what about Ukraine? What would they get from this? Could they be the triggerman? Such an attack obviously is an embarrassment for Russia. While the Russian population are told that the real threat to their lives are NATO and Ukraine, hundreds are killed or wounded by the so-called Islamic terrorists. So why isn't Putin concerned about them? Why is all his forces and intelligence apparatus focused on Ukraine when it should be focused on the real enemy, supposedly, which is these quote-unquote Muslim extremists? That's the argument. That's what they want to push forward. That's what Ukraine could use as a spin in regards to these attacks. So while the Ukrainian war doesn't seem to be coming to an end, while the support seems to be waning, Russian support for the war seems to be waning, then we have this attack by ISIS. Could this be the straw that breaks the Russian camel's back and Putin is removed? The issue, however, is although this would fall in line with Ukrainian interests to see such an attack occur, would they have the strategic depth and connections to pull this off themselves, or at least by themselves? There doesn't seem to be much evidence for that. But embarrassing Putin, weakening his perception, or opening up another front for Russia to battle with wouldn't just serve Ukraine's interests, but also America and NATO allied countries' interests. So could Western countries really be involved? Let's understand that Western states led by America do not expect Ukraine to defeat Russia militarily. Obviously, that's not the objective for Ukraine. Ukraine's objective is simply to defend their territory. If they can do that, wear the Russian military down, make it a war of attrition, make the price of victory too high for the Russians to carry on, and therefore the Russians withdraw, then that means that Ukraine, America, and NATO have won. For America and the West, it's about draining Russian support, wearing them down, wearing down their military capacity and their economy such that they withdraw from the war. But there's also another strategy the West is pushing, which is to create disaffection amongst a close circle around Putin and also the powerful oligarchs of the country, such that there's what's called a palace coup. Hence why the West began freezing Russian oligarchs' accounts, seizing their yachts, their luxury homes, their football clubs, etc. Put pressure on them, because by doing so, they would put pressure on Putin, even may remove him. And part of that pressure is to weaken Putin's leadership in their eyes, in the eyes of his people, in the eyes of these powerful oligarchs. And certainly a terrorist attack, killing and wounding hundreds, damages Putin's reputation. But do the West have the capability to orchestrate this type of attack? As I mentioned, ISIS had been infiltrated by Western spy agencies. This is a tactic Western states use against terrorist organizations. Even the IRA had British spies operating within them. America isn't adverse to using terrorist groups and for its own political interests. There's a long list of such incidences. For instance, the support of the Contras in Nicaragua, the support and financing of terrorists in Cuba, supporting right-wing militias in Colombia. In fact, the Turkish president himself accused America of supporting ISIS in Syria, claiming he had video and photographic evidence for this. And for those from Pakistan, they'll also remember the Raymond Davis affair. He was a CIA operative in Pakistan. He was arrested for killing 2 people on a motorbike. He claimed they came to attack him. However, when the police searched through his phone, computer and belongings, they uncovered his close links to terrorist groups like the TTP, who undertook numerous terrorist activities against Pakistan. And it should be remembered that members of the TTP went on to help form ISIS in Afghanistan, i.e. the Islamic State of Khorasan, who are supposedly behind the attacks in Russia. So there is plausible links between the attacks, the people who perpetrated, and the West. They also benefit from the Russian concert attacks. But would the West really undertake such clandestine operations and activities? Well, we had the bombings of the Nord Stream pipelines that supplied Russian gas to the European Union. Nord Stream pipelines were severely criticized by America. Both Biden and Trump criticized Europe for allowing this pipeline to be built, claiming it would lead to Europe being held hostage by Russia. So when the pipelines were blown up, amazingly, America claimed that Russia had done this to themselves, that they destroyed the pipeline that would serve their interests. But this was at the time when the pipelines themselves weren't even in use because of the Ukrainian war. In fact, in late 2022, a former head of the BND, which is the German's Foreign Intelligence Service, August Hanning, said that Russia, Ukraine, Poland and Britain had a plausible interest in disabling the pipelines, as well as America. If Russia wanted to halt gas, they could have just turned off the gas rather than blowing up their own pipelines. It doesn't serve their interest, it serves America's interest. And the point is that it is plausible to say that America blew up the gas pipeline for their own interest. They didn't like it in the first place, as I mentioned. So America would benefit from such an attack, either Russian concert attack. They have had previous dealings with terrorist organizations, including relationships and links to ISIS, and they have undertaken plausibly clandestine actions in the Russian-Ukraine conflict. So it's not far-fetched to think that America would use terrorist organizations to achieve its geopolitical interests. It is true that America knew about the attacks beforehand, that America told Russia of a potential attack, and that Putin claimed that this forewarning was an attempt to destabilize Russian public opinion. But maybe America forewarned in order to absolve themselves of any blame in orchestrating the attacks in the first place. In fact, if Russia had acted upon America's warning or not, in both cases it would have seriously damaged Putin's reputation. So even if Russia had thwarted the attacks based upon the American intelligence that was given to them, serious questions would have been raised why such effort is put into Ukraine when these extremists are a bigger threat, and that they have to rely upon American intelligence because of all of their intelligence and security services used and utilized against Ukraine, when in fact they should be diverted against so-called Muslim threat. As for Israel, it's true that Putin criticizes Israel. Putin sees this as a way to win favor of the Muslim world, as well as expose and embarrass the West for its complicit support in a plausible genocide. However, it's unclear what exactly Israel gets from this. See, when you utilize various assets in a region, it's not just done because you don't like the other state's language and how they speak about you, but rather it's done in order to achieve some sort of policy change. In that respect, Russia hasn't changed its policies with regards to Israel. It still engages with Israel on trade agreements, and beyond some rhetoric and votes in the UN, it doesn't really fundamentally threaten Israel or its interests. I suppose you could say that Israel would be happy to see a Russian attack, as it shores up the narrative that Islamists are a threat and they're fighting Islamists in Palestine, in Gaza with Hamas, and so therefore, these Islamists have to be attacked everywhere. But beyond some propaganda points, there's little further direct benefit for Israel. In the grand scheme of things, however, Ukraine, America, West, and Israel could be seen as one bloc. It serves their interests in a general sense to see Russia and Putin in this particular weakened state. However, in terms of who's plausibly behind this, it doesn't seem that ISIS alone scenario is a plausible scenario, not compared to what we have said about America in terms of its infiltration of terrorist groups of the past, as well as the benefits that it gets and it served with regards to weakening Putin in Russia. We can never be 100% when making these assessments, but what we can do is analyze the events and make plausible conclusions based upon those evidences. So the question is, who is to blame? Well, Actually, that's broken down to who benefits more, as we've talked about America and the West. Who has utilized terrorist groups in the past, as we mentioned, America and the West have. Who has infiltrated these groups, as we know America has. And who has undertaken clandestine actions as well in the Ukrainian-Russian conflict. Again, America. Knowing those answers gives us a probable candidate as to who is truly to blame.